Hello and welcome to another episode of Gemstone Mine. I'm John, and today we have another multifaceted episode. These are the episodes which are a lot less scripted, a lot less editing, where I'm just going to go through and try to dig into some topic or topics that are of interest. And this time, if you might have guessed from the title, we're going to be looking at some listener questions in a mailbag style episode. If you enjoy this or any of our other content, don't forget to give us a like or subscribe if you happen to be on YouTube, or any kind of rating you do on any other podcasting app you might be enjoying this on. Without further ado, why don't we get on to our first question? Mestamu16 writes, kinda new to MTG and making a landfall deck. What are some thoughts on Tatyova versus Aesi as commanders? I'm currently using Aesi. So, Tatyova and Aesi, I assume we're probably talking about the original Tatyova? Why don't we take a look at the two options in that case? So one of them was Aesi of Dire Straits, and I've already made the joke about this making me think of the Dire Straits. I'll try not to make that joke too many more times. Aesi is 6 mana, 4 green and a blue for a legendary creature Serpent, a 5/5 with landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card, and you may play an additional land on each of your turns. While Tatyova, I assume we're probably looking at the original Tatyova. So that is 3 green and a blue for a 3/3 legendary creature Merfolk Druid with landfall, and whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and draw 1 card. Personally, I lean a little bit more towards Tatyova just because you then get the little bit of the cost savings. It's probably not that big of a deal in a Simic landfall deck. It's probably not that hard to get to 5 versus 6. It's been a while since I've played a dedicated landfall strategy, though, so I couldn't give you a really good opinion on just what the difference between 5 and 6 really is. To me, it feels like a lot, but at the same time, when you're looking at Aesi, you do kind of get that exploration effect built in, where it gives you the extra landfall each turn. You probably still, though, want to wind up running a few other of the exploration effects. Like, you probably still want Azusa, you probably still want Burgeoning, but you may be able to cut down on the number that you really need and lean more into ramp spells. Versus with Tatyova, you probably want a mixture of both. I think each deck is going to be slightly different in that way, and really I would just say pick which one you enjoy playing more. And Aesi does make it a little bit more slot efficient to be able to just run things like Nature's Lore, run cards like 3 Visits to get your extra landfalls, and just you're ramping at the same time with the spell you're using to enable additional landfalls. Okay, our next question comes to us from James Greenwood, who asks, what is the 8x8 theory? So 8x8 theory is an old blog I really read a lot of years ago, who are still around. And essentially they describe it as a mathematical approach to deck building, where basically they posit that each deck should have 8 packages of cards, each of which is made up of 8 cards, and then 35 land slots. So 64, 8 times 8, plus 35 equals 99. They say right in their description that this is not supposed to be a set of rules for building an EDH deck list, but an initial jumping off point for the beginning of the deck building process. And it's a pretty clean approach when you can say, here's my package of 8 removal spells, here's my package of 8 creatures that I want to play, here's my package of 8 ramp spells. It makes it very clean to keep things organized, and as you kind of build and develop your deck and cards start to fall into multiple slots, so something like you're playing a Soul Sisters style deck, you want a creature, and you want a removal spell, well in that case why not run Reclamation Sage, since it is both going to get rid of artifacts and enchantments while also triggering Soul Sisters? It winds up working out that way. It's a really good starting point and something that was really important to me during my formative Commander years. Our next question comes from Johan Knutson, asked, would you be willing to share your deck list for Trey Lasara? Yeah, no objections whatsoever. Trey Lasara is one of my favorite casual decks. I describe it as being kind of a battle cruiser style of deck. I will post the link in the description as well as the link to any other sites or anything that I mention in this episode. But basically, if you're looking at the deck list, the whole concept behind the deck is it really wants to land a turn 1 Soul Sister like Soul Warden or Soul's Attendant or even Essence Warden. just so that way on turn 2, when you then cast the commander, you're going to get the ETB trigger off of the Soul Sister, and Trey Lasara's life gain trigger will then go on the stack. So Trey Lasara is green and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature elf cleric with, whenever you gain life, put a +1/+1 counter on Trey Lasara and scry 1. It's a lot of fun for me because I get to make those decisions constantly of, is this top deck what I want to see next turn, or should I tuck this to try to look for something better? I came up with this deck when I was really trying to get better at mulligans, something I still feel like I do need to continue to work on, but it really helped me kind of hone in on what the deck wants to do. For example, early on, I'm probably going to try to look for another Soul Sister effect or other life gain effects, so that way I can start triggering Trey Lasara multiple times per turn. At that same time, I'm probably also going to dig for a true card advantage engine, something like Oran Frostfang to get additional card draws, or even Augur of Autumn, who is 1 green for a 2/3 human druid. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may pay lands from the top of your library, and if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, which Trey Lasara plus a Soul Sister plus Augur of Autumn is almost immediately going to give you that. You can then play creatures from the top of your library as well. So it winds up combining really nicely with Trey Lasara's triggers. Overall, it's just basically a beatdown deck with the commander as the primary form of damage. As I start to get into late game, I'm looking for things that will enable trample, like Nylea, God of the Hunt, or Kodama of the West Tree, or even good old-fashioned Rancor. Anything that'll make it so Trey Lasara has a form of evasion to close out the deck. Again, deck list link will be in the description. Our next question comes from Tuss, and they write, I don't know if you could do a video on it, as it's a difficult question, but I think a good topic to examine would be what happens when you go for it, but then get stopped. Tuss then goes on to an example of, say you play your Crater Hoof, you have enough to knock 2 players out, but not enough to knock out the 3rd player. What should you be doing in those situations? Should you still be going for it? Should you be waiting until you can end the game altogether? And Tuss, you're right, it's a really difficult question to try to answer. It kind of depends on the nature of your play group and the environment that you're playing in. For example, at Oktoberfest of 2022, I was playing my Vol Azorius combo deck, and I had the option to eliminate a player in one of the Swiss rounds, and I went for it to eliminate them, even though it's not something you see really commonly in CDH. The reason I did that, this was a Brea player who had already shown us that they had Rings of Brighthearth, and they had Basalt Monolith. So they had a combo online to generate infinite mana, just nowhere to put that infinite mana. In addition, they were one of the main threats for being able to interact with my game plan, so I presented Vol plus Umbral Mantle, which would allow Vol to become unboundedly huge, and eliminated them from the game. On the other side of the coin, at a really casual table, for example, one of my regular in-person playgroups includes 2 very new players, and now an even newer player, I will often not eliminate players until I could end the game, simply because I don't want to leave somebody sitting out, as really this play group treats it more like board game night, where we're all sitting down together to play a game, and we're not really so much playing to see how fast you can knock somebody out, but instead how long you're able to just enjoy the game together. Your question, Tuss, seems to kind of fall in the middle, like what is the optimal play to do when you potentially leave yourself open to crackback? From a CDH standpoint, you might look at that as a form of king making, where I'm going to knock one person out, but then they can knock me out, and then they win. And it can be a really difficult deck building decision of how you want to try to prevent that. Alternatively, you could potentially look at it as, instead of eliminating 2 players, I'm going to eliminate 1 player, then hopefully still have a big enough board advantage to be able to whittle down and eventually beat the other 2 players. Another kind of big way to look at it from a big picture perspective might be you have a chance to go for it, but if you miss, how do you then rebuild and kind of come back afterwards? This is often where you're going to have multiple win conditions built into your deck. For example, famous example in CDH would be something like Rog Silas, one of those Turbo Grixis Ad Nauseam decks. You're not just running Ad Nauseam as your win con. You're also going to be running good old-fashioned Thoracle Consult. You're likely also going to be on Underworld Breach strategies, and you're just going to keep drawing and digging until you get to those. You don't recover very, very well, but there are still options for you to play out the game, and you're not completely out after you go for it once. Our next question comes from Jonathan Carlisle, and they said, great episode. I love this effect, talking about our Kismet episode, and run Root Maze in my Raga Draga deck. I love saying that. And it works great with dorks. Do you have a list for Archelos yet? So I mentioned Archelos in this deck, and I do actually have a deck list up for it. It is under my personal Moxfield account, I think, and not the Gemstone Mine account. So Archelos Lagoon Mystic is a Kismet effect on legs. It is 1 black, green, blue for a legendary creature turtle shaman, a 2/4 with, as long as Archelos Lagoon Mystic is tapped. Other permanents enter the battlefield tapped, and as long as it is untapped, other permanents enter the battlefield untapped. So I built this deck with the very specific restriction of having Karuga as the companion. Karuga is 5 mana for a 5/4 legendary creature dinosaur hippo with the companion restriction of your starting deck contains only cards with a mana value of 3 or greater and land cards. And when Karuga ETBs, draw a card for each permanent you control with a converted mana value of 3 or greater. Basically, I built this as a clones style deck with Archelos being there to slow everybody else down, while also enabling me to run some much slower lands that have a lot of potential value. The Temple Cycle, for example, giving you an ETB Scry was actually kind of nice. And the Karu land cycle to be able to get a land that will give me 2 different either colors of mana, if you're looking at the original Ravnica cycle, or just 2 mana in general off of the original Vision cycle. And it was basically just a Simic value deck with a little bit of black splashed in there, and it was kind of fine for what it did. One of the tricks to good old-fashioned Karuga is you look for cards that are actually cheaper than they appear to be for Karuga. For example, right here, Reason is a single mana to scry 3, but the mana value of the spell is 6? Yes, 6, because Believe is 4 and a green for the Aftermath side. So there's still things you can do early game before you get to 3 mana, even if you can't do things like Soul Ring. There's also a few cards in here that will cycle, or they're going to have some other effect, like Dismember is going to be a single mana. You can pay Phyrexian mana to do your removal spell. Behold the Multiverse, always beholding. You can do 1 and a blue to foretell the card. Ancient Excavation can be basic land cycled away to go get a basic land just to be ready for your game. Search for Tomorrow can be suspended for a single green mana. So there's a lot of options for even early game when you are just trying to get yourself established. And then once you're established, you're just going to keep playing Karuga, cloning the best thing on the battlefield, reloading your hand, and just drowning people in Simic value. I did wind up taking the deck apart, mostly because the people I played against were getting upset that they were getting overwhelmed with Simic value, which, to be fair, that's kind of what Simic does in casual Commander. So I wasn't surprised, but it's no longer among my staple of decks at the moment. But if it's something you're interested in, please have fun with it. Big shout-outs to the Hermit Druid. Nathan had kind of been the champion of Karuga for a long time, and that's why I decided to build this deck. All right, our next question comes from Florida Man. As a new player, the ramp you get from green seems completely unbalanced. Whew, hot takes time. So I think that the overall value that green gives you in terms of ramp seems more powerful the earlier you are in your journey into the format. And I think that green's ramp is powerful, certainly. But you will often find, for example, at the higher echelons of CEDH, green is not really highly regarded. And I know there's some of my dear friends in CEDH who swear by their mono green decks, by Azusa, by Ashaya, by Yisan, and they're good decks. What green lacks is a really consistent reason to be able to ramp out with mana rocks, because you get to run Collector Oof, which shuts down a lot of the table. Green's ramp basically has a form of summoning sickness in the form of its dorks, or in the form of many of its best search your library for a land and put it into play spells. Green isn't great at getting really strong non-basic lands. It's only good at getting basic lands, or good at getting forests out, which is why kind of the best trinity of green ramp spells is 3 visits, Nature's Lore, and oh man, I'm blanking on the last one there. But those 2 mana spells that are going to put a forest from your library directly into play. And they're really good spells. But when you start to get into the higher echelons of power, spending 2 mana on a ramp spell starts to feel really, really bad. One basic rule that I've really liked is be as greedy as the table will let you be. And in a lot of casual games, it's not unreasonable to say, I'm going to get up to 16, 17 mana this game. And at that point, you are easily outspelling everybody else at the table. If you're finding that you're not enjoying green and you still want to have some game against the green decks, usually what you want to be doing is going under the green player. Mass land destruction is really frowned upon at a lot of casual tables, and quite honestly, it's not great at CDH tables either. It's fine, but it really doesn't always get you where you want to be going at the end of the day. Instead, going under the green ramp player while they are still trying to get to a payoff for all their ramp is probably the right answer. Playing a little bit faster, pressuring their life total, and the politicking being, well, yeah, I'm attacking you, because once you have 7, 8, 9 mana, you're going to be playing spells and creatures that I just have no way to deal with. So I've got to get your life total to a manageable level now, or I'm just dead. Our last question comes from Mint, and they ask, I'm curious as to what the format would do if people didn't have as much access to so many tutors and shuffling, taking a page out of Pioneer's architecture. Deck diversity and win cons would have to be more diverse and more prevalent. And I think that's actually a really good take on what things would probably wind up looking like. Overall, if you don't have access to a lot of tutors, if you're not doing a lot of shuffling, I think our last question about green as a powerhouse of ramp would probably be a lot less felt. They'd be leaning more on mana dorks at that point. In addition, when you start to lose tutors from the format, you lose a lot of those consistency questions and the ability to find the win conditions you were looking for in a deck like in CDH. I think at that point, you're going to see a lot more players falling back on quote-unquote fair win conditions, or they're going to be looking at a lot more layered win conditions overall. So layered win conditions, let's use the example of Underworld Breach, where essentially you're looking for any kind of a wheel effect or a self-mill effect like Brainstorm, plus a way to get additional mana out of the graveyard. So Lion's Eye Diamond is the most common, and just set it up that way so you can continue to get mana out of the graveyard. You can pull some interesting loops and try to do this other ways with things like Eternal Witness out of the graveyard. A lot of decks would probably be pushing in that direction if we're looking at a quote-unquote CDH metagame there. I don't really know what it would look like overall. I think that there would be some decks which would more resemble quote-unquote fair casual Commander, where it's just a lot of beatdown decks. But I also think that you kind of lose out on the ability to have an answer to the person who just is running away with the game. Rebel Sun made a great video over a year ago now in defense of tutors in Commander, where she pointed out that when one person really gets ahead, when they go, turn 1, Command Tower, Soul Ring, Mana Crypt, sometimes the right thing to do at that point is to spend your tutor to, instead of going to get a win con, going to get a mana source so you can keep up with that person. Or maybe it's correct to go get a removal spell like Vandal Blast so that way you can bring them back down to the power of the rest of the table. It brings a lot of interesting options to gameplay, which I really do enjoy, even if I agree that shuffling decks is kind of a pain in the butt. And I would not mind an alternative, but I just don't think we have one in Paper Magic at the moment. Well, that's about all the time we have to answer these questions, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, don't forget to give a like and a subscribe, and if you have more questions, just post them in the comments, send it to us at gemstonemindpodcast@gmail.com, or you can add us on Twitter, and the next time we do a mailbag episode, I'll be happy to answer some more. Until then, I'm John, and this is Gemstone Mind.